Howdy, and welcome to LeeReads, where I talk about the books I've been reading and enjoying lately. This is my August wrap-up, and I have some positive things to say about a variety of different kinds of books. First off, short and sweet, Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher just released. It is a twist on a classic fairy tale. I don't want to say too much because it is short and I don't want to spoil it. Basically, the main character, Toadling, was swapped with the changeling when she was an infant and raised among fairy kind. She picks up a little bit of magic, and one day she is sent to cast a spell, and it doesn't go as planned, and now she's determined that the curse must not get broken. However, after time passes, a very pesky knight has discovered there's a curse that needs breaking, and the story goes from there. It's very sweet, 5 stars, a great twist on a classic fairy tale. So happy that I read The Will of the Many by James Islington, or Islington? I have not read his Lycanius trilogy, which is an epic fantasy trilogy that I've heard great things about. However, I've heard it's kind of complicated. There's a lot packed in there, and you should really read them back to back so that you don't forget things. So The Will of the Many was my first experience with this author. It was very, very high quality from the plot, the pacing, the characters, and the world building. It is Roman inspired, but for me, often when I think Roman inspired, my brain goes to legionaries and war, but that's not really what inspired this novel. It's more how the government was structured. There's like 3 pillars of the government: military, religion, and another one that I'm blanking on, ruled by the Senate and very prominent and influential families. But in this world, there's something called will that can be transferred from one person to the next. And the higher ranking a person is, the more people whose will that they're drawing on. You have like a laborer class that is always ceding a little bit of their will to those above, and then it builds and builds and builds up to a pinnacle. It's also an empire, and it has conquered surrounding countries. So the main character comes from one of these conquered countries, and he does not believe that using will is right. Because of his backstory, he's had a very hard life. He basically gets wrapped up in some intrigue in politics, sent to the premier school for the elite, and is told, I need you to find these things out or else you're going to be punished in a way that I don't want to talk about because I don't want to spoil anything. It's also a magical school setting, but the will, the magic, is not actually allowed to be used while they're in the school. They can rank up and down throughout the semester, so it's not, I'm a year 1, the next year I'm a year 2. You have to really compete and try to rise to the top, and he needs to be at the very top. I really liked the main character and how he viewed the world and how he was cunning and driven. I liked his interactions with other characters, the world building, the interesting magic system. There's just a lot in this novel to recommend it. So if you haven't read The Will of the Many yet, and you like fantasy, especially that has to do with politics and intrigue, then I would really recommend checking this one out. Next book is an audiobook, Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness. It's book 2 after A Discovery of Witches, which is a series that's really hard to describe. It starts out as contemporary fantasy, veers somewhat historical, follows 2 main characters. One is a witch who is a scholar. She studies alchemy, and she stumbles over this magical book that has been spelled to protect it, and it's a very valuable book for reasons. One of the other creatures who wants it is this vampire who is a genealogist and thinks that it holds answers to some genealogical questions he finds very important. They meet because of this book, and it launches this whole sort of epic, romantic, historical story. So this is book 2. I can't really summarize what happened in it so that I don't spoil the first book, but I also have the 3rd book in the trilogy, and I will be finishing that up soon. And then also I have a couple of fantasy romances that I want to mention about. One is a sensation that I've saw a lot of people talking about it and wanted to know what all the hype was about. The Serpent and the Wings of Night, following the main character who was raised among in this vampire land, but is a human, which puts her at a profound disadvantage from the start. Enters into this trial to be granted a boon by the goddess if she wins. Of course, then has to compete against various factions of other vampires, and there's a romance. I did enjoy this one. There's a novella and a second novel in this series, and then I think there's some other books following different characters. I enjoyed this one, and I will continue on because I liked the interactions between the two main characters, between the two love interest characters. It felt refreshing to me, even though the trial plot is not normally my favorite plot. Then finally, I've had a Libby hold on an ebook for well over a year now, and I thought it was never going to come due, but it's a book that was recommended on Our Fantasy a long time ago called Hearthstone. This book feels like reading Pride and Prejudice, except for the illustrious neighbors that come to rent the house next door. They are wyvern or dragon riders, and they were hired to help deal with the local griffin problem. So it's a different setting, but it does really follow the Pride and Prejudice plot, almost to its detriment. It was so sticking with the Pride and Prejudice vibe that it followed the beats and the characterizations a little too closely, so that it was a little predictable until the end, when it did its own fantasy thing that felt like it came out of nowhere. So I wish that it had a little bit more of a departure from the Pride and Prejudice inspiration and was its true own fantasy story with clear, influences. There is a second book that I am interested in trying because I think at that point it's going to be its own thing. But I found this one really cozy, funny. I didn't really get too attached to like the love story or the love interest, but I just liked basically the twists on the Pride and Prejudice story in a world that has hobgoblins, dragons, an epic storyline going along with it. So that was really fun. If you can get your hands on it, I don't know how readily available it is. And last, I saw in another subreddit a series of books recommended, and I read 2 out of the 3 in the trilogy. It is a medieval, historical romance following the Vadri Brothers. So each book follows a different brother and his story as they are dealing with their positions of power within and around the court of, it feels like it's modeled on medieval England, but it's made up. And what I've really liked about these is it deals a lot with the interpersonal, almost like the forced marriage trope. So you're getting to know these two characters, what they've got going on in their lives, and how they're dealing with their change in station. But my favorite part are the female characters and their outlooks. They're very different. In the first book, you're dealing with a character who's extremely naive. In the second book, you're dealing with someone who has abandonment issues. And the characterizations were very, very well done. So far, I like the first one more than the second because I found the second Vadri brother to be a little bit too manipulative. But I am going to continue on with the trilogy just to finish up, these interconnecting storylines. The last Vadri brother is a jousting champion, so there's going to be some sports in there, which I think sounds pretty fun. So those are the books that I read last month. I think my favorite has to be The Will of the Many. It's the first book in a series, and of course now I can't wait to get to the next one, so I would really highly recommend that one. If you're a T. Kingfisher fan, you have to get Thornhedge. It really hit the spot. I just wish it was longer. Why were Nettle and Bone and why were Thornhedge so short? It's sad. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what your favorite book that you read this month was down in the comments. And as always, don't forget to support your local library.